Editor-at-Large at The Australian, Paul Kelly. Paul, is the political system up to the challenge it faces in delivering what is going to be bold reform necessary in the wake of this crisis?
Well, Kieran, this is the fundamental question. And I think the fascinating thing about what Scott Morrison said over the last few days was he said, when we're looking at the economic reforms, we're going to look at all the reports from the past 10 years. That is, all the reports the political system and the government and the parliament failed to act on. Now, what's required here is going to be a change of mindset on the part of the entire political system. Because what's happened over the past decade is we have not got up the enhancements to income, investment and productivity that the Australian public need to see increased living standards. Now, we can't afford another failure when it comes to these reforms. Reforms designed to tackle what will probably be 10% levels of unemployment. So the point to make about all this is that over the past decade, we've seen quite a few changes of Prime Minister. People think that's been the major problem with the political system. Wrong. That's been a symptom of the problem. The real difficulty with the political system is we have not got the policies out of the political system to sustain the increase in living standards that we need. And we're talking here about all aspects: government, Labor, crossbenchers, business, unions and media. We need a change of mindset to make this work.
And Paul, have you been surprised by the strength of criticism and call for transparency when it comes to China from the Prime Minister, from Peter Dutton and others?
This has been absolutely fascinating, Kieran. What we've seen is a really assertive Prime Minister and a very assertive Morrison government, whether we're talking about the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, Peter Dutton in that interview. And essentially, what they're arguing in moral terms and health terms is completely correct. They're saying there should be an international and independent investigation based on transparency into looking at what happened when it came to the origins of this virus in China. They point out that when we had the Ebola episode some years ago, the WHO made recommendations for change. Nothing happened. Morrison has said, we've got to ensure this doesn't happen again. China is under an obligation to open up and be transparent and make it clear to people about what happened. And what we're talking about here, of course, is that if we'd found out about this earlier, then the deaths of thousands of people could have been avoided. So all that makes sense. But the point I would make about this is there is one fundamental diplomatic principle that China lives by, issue after issue, year after year, and that is no interference in the internal affairs of China or other countries. So have no doubt, the diplomatic consequences of this stand by the Morrison government is going to be enormous. In some ways, despite its rhetoric, it is a dagger at the heart of China's national interest and diplomatic stance. It'll be fascinating to see the way this plays out.
And over the longer term, this virus is having so many different implications and for foreign policy, for local policy. Today we're seeing the app launch. Paul, how important is that in terms of the broader strategy here for the government?
Scott Morrison's made it clear this is really important and it's based on a trade-off. What the government is saying is we want to ease restrictions. We want to get the economy started up again, but we've got to ensure that we can tackle the virus as well. So the tracing app is fundamental to this. It is a health policy tool. It's designed to protect the community. There are built-in privacy and other security safeguards. It will only be accessed by health policy officials. So I think the point to make about this is that one of the ironies here, Kieran, is that a lot of the opposition to the app is actually coming from those people also demanding the economy be cranked up again. Well, I think they need to be a little bit careful about what they're saying, let's start up the economy again, but by the way, we don't want the app. The truth here is that an awful lot of information has been handed over by the Australian public to the big tech firms, to Google and Facebook. And what we're talking about here is a very targeted and extremely limited use of this app for health policy purposes. It's one thing to say you don't trust the government. It's another thing to say that you don't have any obligation to look after the health interests of your fellow Australians. The government needs a 40% take-up. Provided it can convince the public on the privacy issue, I think it'll get that take-up. But that's a big proviso.
And finally, Paul, before I let you go, on those reform measures that we began with, if we finish with that, what are the key things that have to be on the agenda here and now for the Morrison government?
The Reserve Bank Governor started this debate last week here and saying, putting on the table the issue of taxation of income and consumption, infrastructure, workforce training and industrial relations. Now, three principles will govern the approach of the Morrison government to this. The first is it's starting with a blank sheet. It wants everything on the table. It wants a non-ideological approach. The objectives here are about jobs, investment and growth, and it's going to open the lens wide in terms of the dialogue about what to do. Secondly, the government wants to proceed by some measures of consensus, dialogue and agreement. I think this is really important here. It wants to try and negotiate arrangements in which it can see these measures pass through the Parliament. We've seen the Industrial Relations Minister, Christian Porter, tell the ACTU he's going to suspend the normal IR playbook for the next 6 months, including the Ensuring Integrity Bill, in order to try and reach agreement with the ACTU. And thirdly, the government knows the reform agenda is an absolute imperative. This time, there's going to be no walking away. This time, the government is going to have to face up to this, address this, implement an agenda from very high levels of unemployment. It's a test for the government. It's a test for the Labor Party.
Paul Kelly, I appreciate it. Talk to you during the week.